Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Cloud and Clear. My name is David Carter with SADA, and I lead our digital assets and Web3 practice here at SADA. And today I am joined by Chris Sharp from the team at Blockdaemon, who serves as CTO. Chris and audience, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for doing this with us.
No, my pleasure. Thanks so much, David, for having me. Really appreciate it.
Today's topic centers on Web3, why it matters, and how Blockdaemon supports the ecosystem through partnership. Chris, before we dig deeply into that topic in particular, maybe you could tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to your leadership role at Blockdaemon.
It's relatively recent. I joined the Blockdaemon team in May of 2022. Prior to that, I had spent, I think, like 22 years at Apple, and from 2013 onward, building the Apple Pay platform. There were just, I think, in hindsight, I guess I say it's sort of hard to connect the dots looking forward, but when you look back, I can see this sort of clear path to where I am now and how I got here. It's fairly interesting. There's not, I would never have anticipated this in any way, shape, or form. But I think, part of building the Apple Pay platform meant that I got, really sort of deeply into the weeds on some really interesting things around digital identity and security. I don't know, somewhere around the 2016 timeframe, I attended this sort of workshop, blockchains in the web or something to that effect at MIT. And it was just, my mind was blown. And I think ever since then, I've really just wanted to figure out a way to sort of figure out how to do this thing that I've been so passionate about. And ultimately, when I started talking to Constantine and some of the other leaders at Blockdaemon, I was just blown away and thought, wow, this is a an incredible opportunity of a lifetime. I really can't pass up. I get to work on what I've been doing personally, and now it's professional, and work and play and everything gets thrown together, and well, they're going to pay me for it even too. So that was awesome.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's fantastic. And one of the things I find too is the level of excitement, particularly in this ecosystem, as it relates to what becomes possible as we build great tools, and particularly services that support organizations that truly want to take these ideas seriously. That is what really gets me excited. The difference that I know these tools can actually make. So with that in mind, then why don't we really try to set the stage for why Web3 really matters, and then ultimately like how Blockdaemon supports that ecosystem. When we hear the term Web3, and everyone sort of has their own definition for what that means, and how they think it applies to their organization or their work. Um, how does Blockdaemon approach Web3 in particular, and does Blockdaemon even take a real definitive approach to how they define the term Web3?
Yeah, I mean, great question. Any distributed or even decentralized organization, I think depending on who you ask within the company, you're going to get some amount of different answers. But, as a company, we look to enable all of the great ideas, right? So we support over, I think, 60 plus different blockchains. And you look at the number of just absolute amazing, super smart people that are working in this space, and you amplify that by making the connectivity to those capabilities, a single, straightforward, easy to use, highly available, very secure, risk managed sort of connection. And you can start to see how we're kind of an enabler, right? We're going to amplify the good ideas across many different spaces and try to help, connect institutions to blockchains in ways that would have required a lot of like very technical, very hard to find, especially, in these days, like very difficult, hard to find resources. We actually have, an army of like crypto nerds that are, doing research and publishing papers and looking at things. And so these are the resources we really bring to bear as a company looks to partner and get into these things. So I feel like for me, the definition of Web3 is really taking advantage of the sort of trustless, decentralized, unstoppable, really financially inclusive platforms that the broader community is building.
I love it. I love it. The thing that often gets me excited, particularly when it comes to these types of tools and services, is this notion that we all understand that these are open and iterative platforms and services, and as these products improve over time, the sharing in them between ecosystems is almost mandatory. Like we have to grow and get better together, and I love that being a part of the way people think about organizing themselves. To my mind, Web3 allows that, and tools like, particularly when we talk about Blockdaemon to our clients and customers, the thing that we often say is that Blockdaemon is a springboard to taking advantage of blockchain ecosystems in any capacity, and that seems to to resonate really well, and certainly I think to my mind resonates well with that Web3 philosophy.
Yeah, David, I love the way you're framing that. Yeah, 100% agree.
So, you know, we're talking a little bit about like the definitional terms here, but I think maybe it's important for us to talk about like what it means to be building crypto optimized infrastructure and like how that actually applies to some use cases. Like, is there a story that like you're willing or able to share where you could describe a particular use case or a particular client case study that might showcase a use case maybe that people aren't necessarily thinking about, or maybe even one that's been executed particularly well?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many. I think some of the things that are sort of front and center for me are things around multi-party computation. For years, I built secure applications using somewhat legacy HSMs, and with our acquisition of CPOR, there's just this whole new way of doing things that is just so exciting because at its heart, it's a super generic technology. And so wherever you need any kind of digital signing operation, you can effectively make this so that there's, multiple people and backups and, and create thresholds and create, policies that are very powerful. And so, as you look towards the future, I can imagine clients, existing clients of CPR and new clients of Blockdaemon being really excited about that. There's obviously, a lot of excitement around our staking API and, how different customers will use that and take advantage of it. And, we've been very thoughtful about that. We've taken our time to some degree, but I think we have done that in a way that will not only be really scalable, but any kind of investment that companies make in that API, as we roll out additional support for protocols, they're gonna see that's going to pay dividends, right? And we think that sets us way ahead of our competitors.
Now, when you think about like, because what I'm loving about the way you're describing this is that you're not being industry specific at all, because the use cases for this really don't fall within a specific industry. Like these are the same kinds of problems that every single organization that does any type of transaction, really between any ecosystem, whether it's B2B or B2C, between institutions and private corporations, like nonprofits, even like any institution that wants to perform trusted transactions that are auditable and even regulated can do it through these ecosystems.
Yeah, no, exactly. And we have these amazing UX researchers and an incredible UI team, and we're really just trying to look at things from the perspective of, we're not solving things just for VCs or just for exchanges or B2B or just but also B2B to C, and so really what we're trying to do is, as I said earlier, is create a platform that with a single integration creates this enabling capability, and then we bring the experts and the resources to make it so that that transition from Web 2 to Web 3 is more straightforward, and that companies themselves don't have to deal with some of the idiosyncrasies. At the heart of hearts, a lot of these blockchain clients they're open source and they have varying degrees of maturity, and so the ability to run them at an enterprise level and with the kind of security and reliability that we have is really the magic, right? And so companies that attempt to do this on their own certainly can do it, but it just requires a lot of time and hard learning in some cases.
Now that's fair. And sort of speaking to that transition, right? So, as organizations move from, platforms and services that they know into these, these Web3 ecosystems, um, I would imagine that there's probably an adoption process that you're bearing witness to. Like, how would you encourage companies that are thinking about taking advantage of or thinking about the use cases for these tools? Like, how would you encourage them to go about sort of taking their first steps?
I love our what we call our Ubiquity API. So it's essentially a blockchain agnostic API. As someone that comes from a development background, for me, the proof in the pudding, so to speak, is always looking at the API docs. And that was literally like on day one, I was like, oh, this is great. I got to build a client and see how this stuff works. That's going to be the way I think certain people within certain parts of an organization start to sort of understand the depth and the breadth that we bring. And then, once you open that hood and you start looking underneath a little bit, maybe there are some scenarios where you might need some blockchain specific capabilities, in which case, again, the Ubiquity API that doesn't only support the agnostic sort of, blockchain agnostic side of the interface. It also supports the raw and native side of things. So if there are things you need to do to get down and get underneath the hood a little bit, you can do that as well. But again, the thing that we think that we're pretty proud of is, the reliability and scalability. We have some pretty big clients that are coming through that. We're just seeing massive adoption. We're seeing a massive number of transactions per second, in terms of load there, and the system hums. It works, and the engineers that have designed it, again, from my experience, are world class. So it's something I'm super proud of.
Well, as a customer, I can tell you right now, I've had that exact experience. So, I realized that, as partners, we get to work together to solve problems for customers and problems for each other. Um, but I've also had a chance to take advantage of this ecosystem outside of my capacity at SADA and some of my previous history. And, I can say firsthand that working with your engineering teams have been fantastic. Like, this speaks really well to Blockdaemon's capabilities. And one of the things that I find to be, not just insightful but really hopeful, is that, this community, the community that your team has built, is leading the way on getting good at managing and addressing blockchain infrastructure and services around them. But I would say that, like, broadly speaking, like the majority of folks out there who encounter terms like blockchain and Web3, they they see things from a very limited perspective. Usually they get a 15-second or maybe a 1-minute soundbite. And oftentimes it's about the hype cycle, whether, number go up or, everything's crashing and it's, everything's terrible. You know, how would you try to, um, characterize, right, the state of where this industry is right now, and maybe what like what you're hopeful for coming, coming soon?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think if you look back, and people always say, like, look back at the early days of the internet, and whatnot. I think we are at the beginning here. It is a new paradigm. There is a hype cycle, and there's a lot of people that don't really understand, the true benefits. For me, when I think about, trustless systems, that's an incredibly powerful idea, right? And the ability to some of the DeFi protocols that are being built. You read the Uniswap V3 white paper, and it's such an elegant, simple concept that any fifth grade math student could really understand. But it's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. And you put these things together, and they unleash this sort of financial inclusion and sort of democratizing of financial services that is the promise. And that said, wallets are hard to use, and we don't have a lot of interoperability between the blockchains. And there's incredible researchers. Actually, we've got Raphael within the Blockdaemon team is doing a lot of research in this cross blockchain communication and relay, and just incredible work. He's a PhD student, and so it's just, there's a lot of big bright minds working on this. And if you look today, if I were to say, hey, mom, I'd really love it if you could do X, Y, or Z. Some of those things are going to be more difficult now than they will be in the future, right? And so I think the promise is there, the focus is there, the incredibly smart people that are working in this space are there, and we just, people are going to be, dialed into making things, easier and easier and safer and safer. another area for places where I can see there being improvement is key management. Like the sort of 12-word mnemonic that we're all used to for the hierarchical wallets is cool and it's helpful, but for a regular consumer, maybe there are ways that we can improve that. And some of the multi-party computation stuff and whatnot that I was talking about before has the promise of helping us get to that really like that amazing place where even key management is something that we're just not worried about anymore.
Yeah, yeah. And I have to say, like, I'm a card carrying member of, literally a phrase that I have to physically keep because, yeah, it's not easy. It's not easy. So you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
Those are some wicked problems that we have yet to solve. And I think going back to your earlier statement that this is a lot like the beginning of the internet. Like in the year 2000 and 2001, high-speed internet was still novel. It was still new, and even the way people connected wasn't always the same. And
Yeah.
I think we're experiencing that very same thing now. Very insightful, Chris. Thank you for that. So, as you're talking about those wicked problems, I want to focus more on blockchain, Blockdaemon's approach to solving those particular issues. One question I definitely want to cover here is that like one of the things you had mentioned earlier really centered around this notion of trustless architecture being a core component of Web3 ecosystems. And from that point of view, that means that there has to be a lot of security and risk mitigation that's built into the way these products are built out. Could you maybe speak to how Blockdaemon addresses that particular concern for your customers and sort of maybe how you even approach it yourselves internally?
Yeah, sure. So there's, we're ISO certified. So, that's one, thing it's a big feather in our cap, and as we're working with big customers, big banks, this is something that's really important. And so all of the processes in terms of, business continuity and, all of those fun things are things that like we've thought about and we have taken care of. And we've had a third party like, sort of give us the stamp of approval. I think the other thing is, along with that are, the sort of mundane, not mundane, but the things that we are doing constantly behind the scenes. We have some of the most brilliant like security engineers I've ever worked with, and these folks are scanning our Git repositories and they're looking at cross site JavaScript injection-y kinds of things. They're making sure that all of our IT infrastructure is secure and that only authorized folks are able to get access to things. We've got a team of cryptographers that are looking at key management services that again are going to build off of this investment we made in multi-party computation, so that we're able to make claims around how we handle some of the sensitive material related to our validators and whatnot in ways that we think blow our competition out of the water. And then you have all the sort of front end stuff, the login and the TLS and access to the APIs and whatnot. That is just par for the course, and most SaaS companies are doing. But we don't only just have the basics, but we've got a bunch of things that are happening in the background. In addition to sort of having sort of an insurance for slashing, and so people that stake with Blockdaemon can sort of just leave it to us and we'll take care of things, whether it's the very beginning and the onboarding to the monitoring to the reaction. We've got a group of people we call our protocol specialists that are literally looking at the Discord channels, looking at all of the different sort of community insights, and are staying on top of these over 60 different blockchains so that our customers don't have to. Right. We've had engineers in the past that actually helped protocols fix some of their bugs, right, and have jumped in because that's the depth and breadth of the knowledge that these folks have. And so it's really a full stop shop. Like people come to us, they connect to us with one integration, and they're getting all of these things kind of in the background. And it's something that we're all actually very proud of, because each of the individuals that's working on these different protocols is really personally and professionally very invested in helping the community. We try to give back from an open source perspective. We try to make sure that we're being as transparent in any kind of learnings that we have. But these are the things that benefits all of our institutional and business partners that trust us when they kind of come on board with us.
I love it. In particular, the notion that this is a continually growing space, this work is not complete, and there's so much more to do. Quite frankly, I
Yep.
never wake up in this space and feel like there's less to do tomorrow than there was to do today.
No, and the blockchain nodes are a beast. These are hard things to deal with. We've got one engineer on our team. His name is Guillaume. He's working on a feature called smart routing, and this is this absolutely brilliant capability of really connecting to a variety of different nodes and looking at their health and deciding sort of intelligently how to make sure we can service these requests as quickly and as accurately as possible. So again, there's a lot of things that we're doing in the background to really make these services as scalable and as reliable as possible.
So speaking of that partnership component that you had mentioned earlier, Chris, like with partnerships that Blockdaemon possess with folks like Crypto Compare, for example, like how do you think about the notion of helping and support clients, quite literally building blockchain infrastructure on top of layer 0 and layer 1 platforms? Like how does Blockdaemon approach those kinds of situations?
Yeah, I mean, we're all like we all deeply believe in the promise of these decentralized networks, and so where there's a way that we can lend a hand in terms of the knowledge and whatnot, I think we try to. We obviously try to make a big investment in an API first approach and making sure that we codify literally all of the things that we've learned into things that engineers can access programmatically so that people don't have to, go through that learning process. But, for key customers and for places where we want to really lean in, I'm talking to people all the time, we're brainstorming with folks in different parts of the world on how can we take some of the financial inclusion and whatnot and share some of the ideas that may be terribly obvious to the people that are in the space, but if you're not in the space, then it could take. There's a period of time where you have to get up to speed, where you have those big aha moments, and we're happy to do that.
Well, that's certainly been my experience with Blockdaemon. So I come from a previous crypto project where we had a chance to work with your team as a client. And I have to tell you, the things that you brought up without even prompting, which is that you've engaged ecosystems in helping them solve their actual node issues and bugs in their code. I've experienced that directly from your team. So I yeah,
Wonderful to
definitely
hear.
appreciated, absolutely experienced that. And quite frankly, those are the kinds of what I would call like core and principal values that help make it really easy to interact with companies like Blockdaemon. So that's I love it. I love it.
David, thank you for sharing that. I love to hear that. Thank you.
Yeah, well, it's true, so it makes it easy. Um, so I want to talk a little bit about what's next. So from a practical perspective, I'm interested about like some of the things that you're most excited about coming out of Blockdaemon, maybe coming out of the industry. Like you had mentioned a whole lot of those core challenges and problems that we all possess, but the industry itself needs to help solve. I'm interested to hear um, as much as you're allowed to share.
Yeah.
What's on the horizon for Blockdaemon, and then ultimately, what are you excited about as far as what's on the horizon for Web3 in general?
Sure. I mean, on the blockchain front, the team has been scrappy and rolled their sleeves up and getting 60 protocols out. It's just this phenomenal work, right? And so really, I'm sitting on the shoulders of giants, right? And my goal as CTO is really to just refine and take things sort of to the next level. And if you look at our different products, we've got an on ramp that goes from fiat to cryptocurrency, and taking that and as I mentioned, some of my experience at Apple was around security and identity and whatnot. And so, trying to figure out how we can weave some of those stories and really making that not only as secure but also super easy to use. The status quo today in the industry is that some of these things are, they're going to ask you to pull out a picture of your this and take a picture of that, and some of these things are okay, but I think there might be better ways to solve some of those problems. You look at our staking business and really leaning in on making sure that companies, exchanges in particular, can access some of these things in a single API. In some cases, that's super important to us. Making sure that we're really thinking about not just sort of checking boxes, but really going across all of our products and services and making sure that these things are well thought out and the dots are connected across the different verticals, right? When you look at things like liquid staking, super exciting, super exciting for us. And I think when I look more broadly, that sort of dovetails into my views on where I sort of see things going. I'll call it DeFi for all, but the over collateralization now for loans as an example is good, but I think we can do better. Areas of liquidity, as I mentioned, are potentially interesting. Staking is great, but if you were to tell the average customer that they have some sort of unbonding period, they might not understand that. There's no metaphor in the real world. If I go and do something, I expect to be able to get that right back and use it somewhere else and whatnot. And so doing that, and then really kind of looking around the corner, so to speak, and connecting these things, right? Once you have the liquid staking token, how do you make sure that you can do something with that, and making it so that institutions can more easily connect that back into all of the innovative DeFi protocols that are currently being built. Right now we're in this sort of crypto winter, bear market kind of thing, and our view is this, that we're heads down building. And we've got an incredible team. We've got people focused on things, and as the market changes and turns, we're going to be in this really fantastic place to come out and show the world all the things that we're totally heads down on. As far as more forward-looking things, I mentioned DeFi for all. I can also see there being, this sort of, a second wind in NFTs and true digital ownership, and the really amazing user experiences you can get when you start to mix and match physical world and digital world user experiences. And then there's just a whole host of things there that I see, getting easier and better and more user friendly. At the end of the day, I think finally, you may see, things in terms of actually the original thesis of being sort of a medium for exchange, and especially in highly inflationary environments, I could imagine that there would be a natural incentive for people to start to adopt those things. And in some cases it's been a bit of a chicken and the egg, right? Until you can use it somewhere, you kind of just have to hold on to it. And I could see that changing perhaps even more quickly than we can imagine. And once we do, that just unlocks a massive amount of value and financial inclusion. It pulls a whole host of folks worldwide into the digital fold here that we just haven't seen in I don't think in our generation, honestly. I think this is a big thing. It's a game changer.
Agreed. Wow, Chris, really insightful. Thank you so much for being willing to share this with us here at SADA and on Cloud and Clear. This is a to my mind, I what gets me so excited is that I know for a fact that this is the right, these tools, this way of thinking about delivering and supporting the speed of economic energy being able to be accessible by all, like that this is quite literally the beginning of that journey. And I can't wait to see what becomes possible because of that. And I'm so glad that you and your organization are working on these problems. So thank you for sharing that with us. And I just want to say that being a partner with Blockdaemon is absolutely an honor here at SADA. We absolutely appreciate that partnership with you, and we look forward to seeing what comes next.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And just as a final comment, you use the word partner, and that sums it up really well because when you're a partner, you have ideas that are flowing in both directions, and that's been the real benefit to us is being able to be at the table with giants and get help and be connected to resources. So very much appreciate being here, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to Cloud and Clear. Check the show notes for links to this week's topics. And don't forget to connect with us on Twitter @Cloud and Clear and our website, sada.com. Be sure to rate and review the show on your favorite podcast app.